Good evening, or good day, depending on where you are, where you're watching this. It is the start of the second day of the NATO summit in Vilnius. That's just kicking off an hour or so ago. There are some interesting news items coming out of day one. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has made comments about him not being impressed with China, unhappy that China refuses to condemn Russia's war with Ukraine. He has stated that the country of China is undermining the foundations of the rules-based world order. And that the NATO allies will work together against such behaviour by China. So it's interesting that this has come out at this time when NATO is heavily involved in a proxy war with Russia at the moment, instead of perhaps trying to just tamp down or improve relations with China. It seems that, if anything, they're being inflamed by this language at this time. Stoltenberg also commented that the NATO, there's an agreement there that NATO will approve a force of up to 300,000 soldiers to be on standby. This will include Air Force and Navy components of those numbers. Now, there had been some talks before the NATO summit that number may go as high as 400,000. NATO troops in a ready mode, on a standby mode. It's an interesting thing to think about. If they are putting up to 300,000 NATO troops into a standby mode, what are they on standby for? Are they simply preparing for a possible scenario where they need to be able to take on Russia? My reading of the situation is that it is unlikely that Russia will escalate and strike a NATO nation, therefore forcing NATO into having to activate standby forces. So is this perhaps preparation for what NATO may believe in the future will need to be NATO involvement against Russia? If it is, I imagine that this announcement is just an early warning, and that this will take some time for these troops to become ready, and that any future planned NATO involvement with direct involvement in a conflict with Russia would be sometime in the future, giving the West and the NATO nations time to produce ammunition, produce more tanks, produce missiles, as there is a growing wealth of evidence at the moment that the West's abilities and resources and stockpiles in these areas are being tested by the Ukraine conflict. There are also some interesting news coming out, some cracks perhaps starting to emerge between some of the NATO nations. Perhaps not emerge, just some of the existing rifts coming to light. Even some reporting from the Kiev Independent newspaper that they're reporting that the West is responsible for the Ukrainian offensive, in that they haven't provided enough aid, and they haven't provided enough training and material to the Ukrainian nation to be able to take on Russia. Obviously, this is not the sort of thing that the West wants to be hearing from Ukraine, but you can understand how Ukrainians must be starting now to wonder, how they must be getting very frustrated and starting to feel that perhaps this NATO involvement may never be any more than just using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Even President Zelensky has tweeted out that he feels that the lack of a confirmed time frame for Ukraine entering into NATO is unprecedented and absurd, he calls it. Some of the imagery coming out of the first day of the summit, if you're reading the imagery that's coming out, it doesn't look as though it's going well for Zelensky there. There are a number of photographs showing him on the sidelines, isolated, looking very frustrated with the NATO representatives there. Now, I'm sure that these photos are chosen because of the impact they have, the way they look. But there are a number of them which I must admit give the impression that Zelensky is not enjoying his time there at the NATO summit. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has come out and made a statement and said that what Ukraine needs is peace, not more weapons. He has called for an immediate ceasefire and for peace negotiations to commence, and has gone further to say that he believes that there are tens of thousands of Hungarians who are at imminent risk if there isn't a cessation of the conflict and the fighting, and if the war continues or escalates. Here, I think he's referring to the ethnic Hungarians living in what's called Transcarpathia, or the Zakarpattia Oblast of Ukraine. So this is an area of Ukraine on the far west of Ukraine, which borders onto Hungary and was prior to 1945 or prior to 1944 a part of Hungary, which was ceded to Ukraine in 1945. So as you can imagine, there are people who will have considered themselves Hungarian in large numbers, who will have lived there for generations, who still have strong ties to Hungary, but are in effect geographically now and politically within the boundaries of Ukraine. As expected, given that Turkey and President Erdogan did change their stance on vetoing Sweden's accession to NATO. The Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó of Hungary, has announced that Hungary will also now drop their veto against Sweden. So it does look as though now the final steps for Sweden being admitted to NATO is for the government of Hungary and of Turkey just to ratify that decision, but that's likely to go ahead. So Sweden will likely join NATO. That may perhaps be the one positive thing for the West and Zelensky out of this summit, is that they can claim that they have another nation that's joined. However, as I say, in general, particularly from Volodymyr Zelensky's position, the first day of the summit has not been one where he has got a great deal to be happy about. There has been an announcement that there will be a training program commencing for F-16 fighter pilots and maintenance crews, that will be kicking off relatively soon. Yesterday, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, he has announced that they will be supplying long-range missiles, which are in effect the French version of the British or the UK Storm Shadow missile. An interesting comment I saw on that was someone asking if the fact that the French are now providing these is an indication that the UK stocks of Storm Shadows are getting low. There have been numerous reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense over the last month or so of them intercepting and shooting down Storm Shadows. There have also been a number of reports of what seem to indicate Storm Shadows successfully hitting targets behind the Russian lines. So there has certainly been a number of them used. Of the amount that was sent to Ukraine, I don't know how many have been used so far. And of what number the UK may have in reserve, I don't know. But it's an interesting question, I thought, just to ponder if perhaps the fact that France are now beginning to supply long-range missiles, maybe because the UK is hesitant in supplying more. On a sort of a related topic, there was a series of posts that I saw today where someone was pulling together a story talking about the fact that in June, in June of this year, of 2023, a report came out in Reuters that Germany only had 20,000 high explosive 155mm shells remaining. This was in June. Now, in July, there's been an announcement by the German Chancellor Scholz that the Germans will provide a 700 million euro package. And interestingly, that package contains 20,000 155mm rounds. So where this story was going and the question they were posing was, is Germany now out of high explosive 155mm shells? Of course, the number that Reuters had may have been wrong. They may not have known what the complete number was that the Germans had. The Germans may have produced more since that period of time. But if the numbers were correct in the original reporting from Reuters, and if the number that's going to be provided is expected to be provided soon or quickly, and these aren't this offer of shells isn't one to be delivered well into the future, then again one does wonder, are the Germans getting very low on their 155mm rounds as well? Just this week, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has commented twice within a day that they're running low on shells. Jake Sullivan also mentioned that the fact that the US was approving the supply of cluster munitions to Ukraine was to form a bridge for a period of time to provide them with some shells to be able to fire, because the US was not able to supply them with the preferred high explosive and armor piercing rounds, which is what the Ukrainians would really be after. Now, speaking of the cluster munitions that have been approved to be provided, Dmitry Medvedev commented. As I said, he's really been playing the bad cop from the Russian side in terms of social media commentary. And he commented on a report that cluster munitions had been used on the town of Tokmak. Tokmak is in the Zaporozhye region, sort of to the east in Zaporozhye region, moving across to the Donetsk area. And he had actually given a summary of the first day of NATO and what had been announced there, and then went on to talk about this reported attack on Tokmak with cluster munitions, which brought about the point that once the announcement has been made, that the decision was made well before that, which we've seen before with other weapons provided by the West to Ukraine, where there has been talk that something wouldn't be supplied or hadn't been supplied yet. And then as soon as the announcement is made, almost immediately they're in use. So it appears as though they've already perhaps been supplied before the announcement has been made. Anyhow, in this case, that may have been what has happened here. But interestingly, Medvedev went on to state that this means it's time to unleash our arsenals of this weapon. So obviously the Russians have cluster munitions. The use of them reportedly in terms of the fighting has been low. There's a couple of videos that I've seen showing what is alleged to be Russian use of cluster munitions in urban areas. I've also seen reporting from Patrick Lancaster of similar cluster munitions and petal mines being deployed by the Ukrainians into residential areas. I don't think we've seen a large use of them in the fighting thus far. Certainly the Russians have been using incendiary shells and explosives, but in terms of these cluster munitions, we haven't seen a great deal of that. But Medvedev is now basically saying, look, if you're going to use them against us, we'll start to use them against you. Again, the real loser here is Ukraine. because Ukraine is the country that will end up being littered with these for years to come, and the civilians there will be the people who will suffer from the use of these munitions well after the conflict and the fighting has stopped. On the topic of production, there's been some reporting which has come out. The Rostec's Deputy General Director, Vladimir Artyakov, has indicated that Russia has doubled the production of Su-30, Su-34 and Su-35 fighter jets. So they are ramping that up. There have been reports of deliveries of these happening just recently. This is happening in parallel to the talk of F-16 training programs for Ukraine, but with those F-16s not becoming available until 2024. So again, there seems to be a challenge there for the Ukrainians in terms of air power and obtaining jets to be able to provide some air superiority to them. Also, some of this reporting goes on to say that Ural Gavon Russian heavy machine building company, announced it has increased the supply and overhaul of T-72 and T-90 tanks by 3.6 times of what they were doing last year. The production of BMP-3s, these are infantry fighting vehicles that have a 100mm cannon on them. The production of those has increased by 2.1 times. The BTR-82A, which is a large 8-wheel armoured personnel carrier, production of those has been increased by 4 times. The Tiger M, which is a 4x4 vehicle, an equivalent would be something like the American Humvee. Production of those has been increased by 2 times. The deliveries of the Ka-52 Alligators have increased by 2 times. The Mi-28 helicopters increased by 3 times. And the production, and this goes back to something I was talking about yesterday, the production of the all-land UAV drones has increased by 53 times. Now, obviously, UAV drones would be easier to produce and faster produce than fighter jets and tanks and BMPs, but nevertheless, while we see reports of these other pieces of equipment increasing by 2 to 4 times, the increase in drone production by 53 times. So I think this does align with the thought that the real game changer in terms of warfare, which we've learnt and seen demonstrated in this conflict, is the use of drones, FPV drones, or autonomous drones, because of both the reconnaissance capabilities they provide and also the ability to deploy munitions. On that topic, I saw an interesting video today of the use of a small FPV drone, something not much larger than what you could buy down at your local electronics store, and it was being used to deploy a grenade, a handheld infantry grenade, onto a cluster of anti-tank mines that had been laid across a road to stop a vehicle from travelling on the road. And it worked perfectly. That drone dropped a grenade, zapped out of the area, and the grenade went off and detonated the mines, and the road was cleared. So, yeah, drones are definitely playing a big part in this conflict. So now just move on a little bit of some of the activity that's happened today. Now, while the Ukrainians have been pushing hard for the last month to try to show some advances for the Vilnius summit, they have really struggled to achieve that. And both at the start of the offensive, at the start of June, and again in the last few days, heavy losses of armour and personnel have been reported. I mean, these have been reported with video confirmation all through the last 6 weeks, but particularly heavy losses at the start in the minefields. And in the last couple of days, with accurate use of artillery by the Russians, and again, minefields, heavy fighting has been going on, and it appears that in some areas it's the Russians who have been making advances in the last 48 hours. Just in getting up around the Kupiansk region and Kremenaya, which is just to the east of Liman, there is a forested area there where some heavy fighting has been going on for quite some time. The advances in this area, reported on a number of the maps tracking the battle, is that the Russians have actually made about a 3.5 kilometre advance in the last few days, which is significant and a substantial advance for a front line that has been relatively stable for some months. From this area of Crimea and going upwards beyond it to an area called Kamaznievka, there seems to be a consolidated push by the Russians in at least 3 areas there, where in the last 48 hours they appear to have made some significant advances, getting across rivers and claiming bridgeheads there. This, if it's sustained, would be a significant push towards Kupiansk from the Russians. In Avdiivka, which is just to the southwest of Bakhmut or Artyomsk, where the heavy fighting occurred at the end of last year and early this year. There are reports there of the Russians assuming fire control over an area in which the Ukrainians are located and looking to perhaps start to form the tips of pincers to perhaps begin to wrap around and enclose that area. So at this stage, they've established fire control over the supply roads going into the area where the Ukrainians have been using these roads to supply themselves with reserves and to evacuate people who are injured. Now the Russians appear to have fire control over those roads, which will make that resupply much harder. And quite possibly, because the fighting has been so heavy in Avdiivka, the Russian tactic here might be to form pincers and to choke off those fighters who are in there in a similar way to what they did in Artyomsk or Bakhmut earlier. The Vremka Ledge, there's video of a Ukrainian column of vehicles, armoured vehicles and personnel carriers, fighting vehicles, advancing and coming under very heavy Russian artillery shelling. However, the Ukrainian reports are, and there are some Russians now reporting as well, that column made it through, at least the bulk of them made it through to their destination and were able to successfully capture some territory and push the Russians back in that area. Also, an area that may have been demonstrate a little bit of success for the Ukrainians in time for the summit is that in the Kherson region near in the Dnieper River, where the Antonovsky Bridge is, the islands around that area there, it appears as though the Ukrainians have had some success today in pushing the Russians out of those island areas, perhaps extending slightly their control on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, just across from the Antonovsky Bridge, where they have had quite a significant battle with Russians over the last 2 weeks there. But the Russians appear to have been unable to completely unseat the Ukrainians from that bridgehead area, and the Russians are now being held off from getting too close to that area. So some successes there for the Ukrainians. However, the port of Odessa, over the last 48 hours, there have been a series of reports indicating missile and perhaps Fab 250 or Fab 500 bomb strikes upon Odessa, some of the port regions of Odessa, allegedly of an ammunition dump being struck in that area. This is something that hasn't happened around the ports really since the grain deal was signed between Turkey, Ukraine and Russia last year. given what has happened in the last couple of days, given that the Russians appear to have confirmed that they will not re-sign the grain deal on which expires on the 17th of July, so in just a few days, this seems to be an indication of the Russian stance that, yep, they've recommenced shelling and bombing of Odessa ports. So I would find it, I think, very surprising if we saw the grain deal was extended, given how Turkey have operated over the last week with their supply of mobile howitzers to Ukraine, with the release of the Azov commanders, which were being held under an agreement with Russia in Turkey. And of their agreement to allow Sweden to enter into NATO. All of these things piling up will not leave the Russians particularly happy about this, and the grain deal, I imagine, will now be off. Okay, we'll have some more reporting tomorrow from day 2 of the NATO summit. If you've enjoyed these shows, please subscribe, tell your friends, put a like on, or leave a comment. I'll talk to you tomorrow.